The ice planet Cryos screamed its fury through howling winds that could strip flesh from bone. Dane Merrick fought against the control panel of his rescue vessel as the storm battered his ship like an angry god. Red warning lights flashed across his weathered face while alarms shrieked warnings he already knew by heart. The distress beacon that had pulled him off his routine patrol route was getting stronger, which meant he was close. But close meant nothing if he couldn't survive the landing. The hull groaned under atmospheric pressure as frozen crystals hammered against reinforced plating. Dane's knuckles turned white, gripping the throttle. His jaw clenched tight as the surface rushed up through the swirling white chaos. He'd been flying rescue missions for 8 years, ever since the incident that had destroyed his commercial career, and he'd survived worse storms than this. At least that's what he told himself as the landing gear deployed with a mechanical whine that sounded far too fragile. The impact threw him forward against his harness hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Metal shrieked and twisted as the ship carved a jagged trench through crystalline ice that sparkled even in the dim light. When the vessel finally shuddered to a halt, Dane sat motionless for 3 heartbeats, taking inventory of his body. Nothing broken, just bruised ribs and a splitting headache. He'd walked away from worst emergency protocols kicked in automatically, bathing the cockpit in pale blue emergency lighting. Dane unbuckled and grabbed his survival pack, checking the thermal suit's integrity before venturing outside. The moment the airlock opened, the cold hit him like a physical blow despite his insulated gear. The temperature readout on his wrist display showed -70 degrees and dropping as night approached. He had maybe 2 hours before even his advanced suit wouldn't be enough. The distress beacon led him away from his crippled ship, its signal pulsing stronger with each step he took across the frozen wasteland. Massive ice formations towered around him like the bones of dead giants, their surfaces reflecting his headlamp in prismatic patterns that hurt to look at directly. The wind carried strange sounds, almost like music, that made his skin prickle with unease. Everything about Cryos felt wrong, ancient, and hostile to any form of warm life. He found the source of the signal in a shallow ice cave, its entrance barely visible through the blowing snow. Dane approached cautiously, one hand on his sidearm, the other holding his medical scanner. The device immediately lit up with readings that made no sense. The biosigns weren't human, but they were definitely there, weak and getting weaker. Whatever had sent that distress call was dying. She was curled against the far wall of the cave when his light found her, and for a moment Dane forgot how to breathe. Her skin was the color of polished silver, shimmering with an inner luminescence even in her weakened state. Delicate patterns that looked like flowing script covered her arms and face, glowing softly with bioluminescent light that pulsed in time with her labored breathing. Long hair the color of starlight fell across ornate armor that had been beautiful once but was now scorched and torn. Blood that gleamed like liquid mercury seeped from a deep wound in her side, pooling beneath her in a growing stain that looked black in the dim light. Her eyes opened as he approached, and Dane found himself staring into irises that shifted between violet and ice blue, colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Even wounded and dying, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And that thought terrified him. "Stay back." "Human," she whispered in perfect standard, though her accent gave the words a musical quality that sent shivers down his spine. "I require no assistance from your primitive kind." Her voice carried authority despite her obvious pain, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. One trembling hand reached for a weapon that was no longer there, and the gesture would have been pathetic, if not for the fierce pride burning in those impossible eyes. Dane ignored her protests and dropped to his knees beside her, his medical training overriding everything else. "Yeah, well, your kind looks like it's bleeding out pretty fast, so how about we skip the part where you tell me to leave and get to the part where I keep you alive?" He opened his emergency kit, hands moving with practiced efficiency as he assessed her injuries. The wound was deep, probably from an energy weapon based on the cauterized edges, and she'd already lost too much blood. She tried to push him away but barely had the strength to lift her arm. "You do not understand what you are doing. I am Princess Sivara Nix of the Luminar Empire, heir to the celestial throne. To touch me without permission is forbidden by laws older than your species." Despite her words, she didn't resist as he applied pressure to her wound, though her sharp intake of breath told him how much it hurt. Her blood felt warm against his gloves, warmer than any human's, and it shimmered with that same strange luminescence. "Right now, Your Highness. I'm more concerned with keeping you alive than with protocol," Dane replied, his voice gentler than he'd intended. He sprayed antiseptic into the wound, and she hissed through clenched teeth but didn't cry out. Tough, he thought with grudging admiration. He'd seen grown soldiers scream from less. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Sivara's expression darkened, her luminescent markings pulsing brighter for a moment before dimming again. "Betrayal. My own guard turned their weapons upon me during what should have been a routine diplomatic journey. They seek to prevent my ascension, to place another on the throne who will serve their interests rather than the Empire's." She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she could read his thoughts written across his skin. "You are far from any established human settlement. What brings a rescue pilot to this frozen death world?" "Bad luck and a distress beacon I couldn't ignore," Dane answered, carefully bandaging her wound with synthetic skin that would hold until they could get her proper medical attention. If they could get her proper medical attention. His ship was damaged, her attackers were presumably still out there, and they were stuck on a planet that would kill them both if they stayed exposed much longer. "I'm starting to think that beacon was a trap." As if summoned by his words, lights appeared through the cave entrance, sweeping back and forth across the ice in precise search patterns. Sivara's eyes widened with what might have been fear, though she tried to hide it behind that same regal mask. "They have found us," she breathed, struggling to sit up despite her injury. "The assassins know I survived the initial attack. They will not make the same mistake twice." Dane helped her to her feet, taking most of her weight as she swayed dangerously. She was taller than him by several inches, and her body felt different pressed against his, warmer and somehow more present than any human woman he'd held. The thought came unbidden and he pushed it away, focusing on survival. "Then we need to move. Can you walk?" "I have no choice," Sivara replied with grim determination. "But human, you should leave me. There is no reason for you to die alongside royalty you do not know or serve. Take your ship and flee while you still can." Despite her words, her hand clutched his arm with desperate strength, contradicting everything she'd just said. Her pride demanded she send him away, but something deeper feared being left alone to die in this frozen wasteland. "Not happening, Princess," Dane said firmly, adjusting his grip to better support her weight. "Where I come from, we don't leave people behind to die. Besides, my ship's not going anywhere without repairs. Looks like we're stuck with each other." He checked his scanner, mapping the terrain ahead. The search parties were getting closer, their lights cutting through the storm in geometric patterns that spoke of military precision. Sivara gestured weakly toward what appeared to be solid ice at the back of the cave. "There. My ancestors built sanctuaries throughout these lands in ages past when Cryos was still a living world. Press your hand to the wall and think of warmth, of shelter, of sanctuary." Her voice was fading, consciousness slipping away from blood loss despite his efforts to stabilize her. Dane did as she instructed, feeling foolish as he placed his palm against ice so cold it burned even through his glove. For a moment nothing happened, and he wondered if blood loss had made her delirious. Then the wall began to shimmer like heat rising from summer asphalt, the solid ice turning translucent and then transparent, revealing a passage beyond that glowed with soft golden light. Ancient technology, he realized with wonder, beyond anything humanity had achieved. They stumbled through just as the assassins reached the cave entrance, and the passage sealed behind them with a sound like a sigh. In the sudden silence, broken only by their ragged breathing, Dane helped Sivara sit against the tunnel wall. The space around them was warmer than outside, heated by some mechanism he couldn't identify, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with gentle bioluminescent lights similar to the patterns on her skin. "Thank you," Sivara whispered, the words clearly costing her considerable pride. "You risked your life for a stranger, for someone your people have no reason to love. Why?" Her eyes searched his face, looking for deception or hidden motives, but finding only honest confusion reflected back at her. Dane shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Couldn't just leave you there to die. It's not who I am." He checked her bandages, pleased to see the bleeding had stopped for now. "Besides, something tells me this frozen rock just got a whole lot more complicated, and I'll need someone who knows their way around." He tried to make it sound practical, tried to ignore the way his heart had stuttered when she'd looked at him with those impossible eyes. In the warm glow of the ancient tunnel, with death waiting outside and safety somewhere ahead, Princess Sivara Nix of the Luminar Empire allowed herself a small smile. "Indeed, Dane Merrick. I suspect both our fates have just become considerably more interesting." The tunnel led them deep into the heart of a glacier, its walls lined with crystalline formations that sang with a high-pitched frequency just at the edge of hearing. Sivara leaned heavily against Dane as they walked, each step requiring visible effort despite her attempts to maintain dignity. Her luminescent markings had dimmed to barely visible traces, a sign of her weakening condition that worried him more than he wanted to admit. The passage opened into a chamber so vast that his headlamp couldn't reach its ceiling, revealing a structure that took his breath away. The temple was carved entirely from living ice that had somehow been transformed into something more than frozen water. Walls flowed with organic curves and elegant arches that no human architect could have designed, covered in the same flowing script he'd seen on Sivara's skin. Pillars of translucent crystal supported impossible geometries, and at the chamber's center stood an altar made of what appeared to be solidified starlight. The entire space glowed with soft radiance that cast no shadows, filling the air with a sense of ancient peace that made the violence outside seem like a distant nightmare. "This is a temple of preservation," Sivara explained, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "My ancestors built such places across 100 worlds during the Age of Expansion. They serve as sanctuaries for those in need, regardless of species or origin." She gestured to alcoves lining the walls, some containing what looked like sleeping platforms covered in material that shimmered like silk. "We will be safe here. The assassins cannot breach these walls, not without technology that would destroy what they seek to protect." Dane helped her to the nearest platform and carefully lowered her onto its surface. The material responded to her touch, seeming to flow around her body and provide support exactly where she needed it. He conducted a more thorough examination of her wound in the better light, relieved to see that his field treatment had held. She would need proper medical care eventually, but she wasn't going to die in the next few hours. That was something at least. "You should rest," he said, unpacking his survival gear and setting up the portable heater, even though the temple maintained a surprisingly comfortable temperature. "I'll keep watch and try to jury-rig a long-range communicator from what's left of my ship systems. Maybe we can call for help." He deliberately didn't look at her as he worked, trying to ignore how the warm light made her silver skin seem to glow from within, or how her hair spread across the platform like liquid starlight. "There is no help to call," Sivara said quietly. "My betrothed, Prince Thorian Vex of the Crimson Dominion, orchestrated this diplomatic mission. If I send word of my survival to the Luminar fleet, the message will pass through channels he controls. He will ensure that any rescue attempt arrives too late, if it arrives at all. Bitterness crept into her voice, raw and unguarded in a way that suggested she was too tired to maintain her royal composure. Dane paused in his work, turning to face her fully for the first time since entering the temple. Your betrothed tried to have you killed? Why would he do that if you're supposed to marry him? The idea seemed insane, but then again, he knew nothing about alien politics or arranged marriages between empires. Sivara's laugh held no humor. Because our marriage would unite two great powers, yes, but it would also bind Thorian to treaties and laws that would limit his ambitions. He seeks absolute power, not a partnership. Better to stage my death during a tragic accident and claim the throne as my grieving widower, free to rule as he pleases. She touched the wound at her side gingerly, and he saw tears forming in those strange eyes. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, but I chose to believe in duty and honor rather than facing the truth about the man I was being forced to wed. Something in her pain called to Dane's own buried grief. The wounds he'd been carrying for 8 years, since the transport accident that had killed 43 passengers on his watch. He'd been cleared of wrongdoing, the investigation ruling it an unavoidable malfunction, but that hadn't stopped the nightmares or the guilt. He'd been flying rescue missions ever since, as if saving enough lives could somehow balance the scales for those he'd lost. I know what it's like to feel trapped by duty, he said quietly, sitting down near her platform but maintaining a respectful distance. To have everyone tell you what you should do, who you should be, even when every instinct screams that it's wrong. He met her eyes, finding understanding there that surprised him. For what it's worth, you deserve better than a betrothed who'd rather see you dead than share power. They talked through the hours that followed, sharing stories of their lives with a strange openness that neither fully understood. Sivara spoke of growing up in the Celestial Palace, surrounded by luxury but isolated from real connection, groomed from childhood to be a perfect political tool. Dane told her about his years as a commercial pilot, the accident that had destroyed his career, and the loneliness of living in his small rescue ship, moving from crisis to crisis without ever really connecting with anyone. As they talked, the temperature in the temple began to drop. Whatever ancient mechanisms maintained the warmth were failing, unable to compensate for the extreme cold outside combined with Cryos's approaching night. Dane's breath started to mist in the air, and he saw Sivara shiver despite her attempt to hide it. His portable heater was designed for one person in a small space, not a chamber this vast. And its power cell was already showing warning signs of depletion. We need to conserve body heat, Dane said, trying to keep his voice clinical and practical. The temperature's dropping too fast. If we don't do something, we'll both freeze before morning. He saw her stiffen at the implication, pride warring with survival instinct across her expressive features. In my culture, such ... Proximity between unmarried individuals is forbidden, Sivara said carefully, particularly between a princess and someone of another species. The scandal alone could undermine my claim to the throne. But even as she spoke, her shivering intensified, her body's luminescence flickering like a dying flame. Your Highness, Dane said gently, with all due respect, there won't be a throne to claim if you freeze to death. And I'm pretty sure the same goes for me. This isn't about propriety or politics. It's about surviving until we can figure out a way off this ice ball. He moved closer, giving her time to object, to order him away. She didn't. They arranged themselves on the platform awkwardly at first, Dane lying beside her with his thermal blanket spread over both of them. The material from the sleeping surface seemed to help, molding itself around their bodies to trap warmth. Still, They had to press close together, and Dane felt the heat radiating from Sivara's skin even through their clothes. She was warmer than any human, her body temperature several degrees higher. And he realized she was suffering more from the cold than he'd thought. "Your people run hotter than mine," he observed, adjusting their position so more of his body could share warmth with hers. "This temperature might be uncomfortable for me, but it's dangerous for you, isn't it?" He felt her nod against his chest, her breath warm on his neck in a way that made his pulse quicken despite the dire circumstances. "We evolved under a red giant star," Sivara whispered. "Our homeworld's average temperature would cook a human in minutes. This cold is like death itself to me. I can feel it seeping into my bones, stealing my strength." Her body trembled against his, and he instinctively tightened his arms around her. Sharing every bit of warmth his body could provide, they lay in silence for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside the temple's ancient walls. Dane found himself acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, of the way her hair tickled his chin, of the steady rhythm of her breathing gradually synchronizing with his own. It was intimate in a way that went beyond mere physical proximity, crossing boundaries neither of them had intended to breach. "Dane," Sivara murmured his name like a question. "Why did you really save me? You could have taken what you needed from my ship's wreckage and left me to my fate. No one would have known or blamed you." Her hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt simultaneously foreign and natural. He considered lying, offering some noble platitude about duty or morality. But something about the moment, about the vulnerability they were both showing, demanded honesty. "Because when I saw you dying in that cave, the thought of leaving you there made me feel like I was back in that transport, watching people die while I could do nothing to save them. I couldn't live with that again. I couldn't let you become another face that haunts my dreams." Sivara pulled back just enough to look at him in the temple's dim light, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "You are not what I expected from a human. Everything I was taught said your kind were crude, violent, concerned only with your own survival. But you—" She touched his face gently, tracing the line of his jaw with fingers that left trails of warmth on his skin. "You are something different." "Maybe we're both different from what we were taught to expect," Dane replied, his heart hammering in his chest. "Maybe that's what happens when you stop seeing species and start seeing people." They were close enough that he could count the subtle patterns in her irises, watch the way her luminescent markings pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger. Then Sivara closed the distance, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that sent shockwaves through his entire body. Her mouth was warmer than any human's, and she tasted like starlight and honey, sweet and strange and utterly intoxicating. Dane responded without thinking, his hand coming up to cup her face as he kissed her back with all the loneliness and longing he'd been carrying for 8 years. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Sivara's markings were glowing brightly again, pulsing with vibrant light that filled the alcove with soft radiance. "By all the stars," she breathed, her voice shaking, "that should not have happened. I am promised to another, bound by treaties and obligations that stretch across a dozen star systems. This is impossible." "Yeah," Dane agreed, though he made no move to pull away from her. "Probably the worst idea either of us has had. But I'm not sorry." He tucked a strand of starlight hair behind her ear, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "Tomorrow we can go back to being proper and political and impossible. Tonight, can we just be two people who almost died, keeping each other warm?" Sivara considered this for a long moment, and he could see the war playing out across her features. Finally, she nodded and settled back against him, her head on his chest and her arm draped across his waist. "Just for tonight," she agreed softly. Tomorrow we face reality and all its complications. But tonight, she trailed off, but Dane understood. Tonight they could pretend that two people from different worlds could find something real in the darkness. They slept fitfully, wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort, while outside the temple, ancient ice groaned under the weight of the endless storm. Dane woke to the sound of grinding ice and the temple shaking around them. Sivara was already awake beside him, her luminescent markings blazing with alarm as dust and ice crystals rained down from the ceiling. The ancient structure that had stood for millennia was under assault from forces it was never designed to withstand. Through the walls he could hear the unmistakable whine of heavy mining equipment chewing through the glacier above them. "They are bringing down the mountain," Sivara said, her voice tight with fear. "Thorian's forces must have orbital support. They care nothing for preserving this sacred place if it means ensuring my death." She tried to stand but swayed dangerously, still weak from her injury and the cold. Dane caught her, steadying her as another violent tremor shook the chamber. They had minutes at best before tons of ice came crashing down. Dane grabbed his survival pack and helped Sivara move deeper into the temple, following passages that seemed to lead downward into the planet's crust. The walls here were different, lined with crystals that pulsed with inner light, growing brighter as they descended. Sivara's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been fear. "These passages lead to the heart chamber," she explained as they hurried through corridors that twisted and turned in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "It is the most sacred space in any temple of preservation where the ancient rites were performed. We should not go there. It is forbidden to enter such places without proper preparation and—" She trailed off as the roof behind them collapsed with a deafening roar. Cutting off their retreat, they had no choice but to continue forward, emerging into a chamber that made the temple above seem crude by comparison. The space was perfectly circular, its walls covered in crystalline formations that sang with harmonics just at the edge of perception. At the chamber's center stood a pillar of pure white light, solid yet somehow fluid, pulsing with energy that made the air itself hum. Suspended within the light were dozens of crystals the size of Dane's fist, each one containing what looked like captured starfire. The bonds of starfire. Sivara breathed, reverence and terror mingling in her voice. "I thought they were legend, stories told to children. But they are real." She approached the pillar slowly, drawn by something Dane couldn't understand. These crystals contained the life essence of the first luminars, those who walked among the stars before recorded history. It was said they could forge connections between souls, binding them together across the void itself. Another massive tremor shook the chamber, and cracks began spreading across the ceiling. Whatever protection the temple had offered was failing rapidly. Dane felt the temperature plummeting again, dropping so fast that frost formed on his eyelashes. Sivara collapsed to her knees, her body's luminescence fading to barely visible traces. She was dying, he realized with horror. Her injury combined with the extreme cold was too much for even her enhanced physiology to handle. "Sivara." He caught her as she fell, cradling her against his chest. Her skin felt cold for the first time since he'd found her, the warmth that was so fundamentally part of her fading away like a dying star. "Stay with me. Don't you dare give up now." But he could see death in her eyes, in the way her markings flickered and dimmed. "The crystals," she whispered, her hand weakly gesturing toward the pillar. "If we perform the bonding ritual, it might save us both. The energy exchange could heal my wounds and protect us from the cold." "But Dane, you must understand what you would be agreeing to. The bond of starfire connects souls at the deepest level. You would feel what I feel, know what I know. We would be bound together for the rest of our lives, unable to ever truly be separate again." Dane didn't hesitate. He reached into the pillar, his hand passing through the light as if it were warm water, and grasped one of the crystals. The moment his fingers closed around it, power surged up his arm like liquid fire. The crystal pulsed in time with his heartbeat, warm and alive in ways that defied explanation. He placed it in Savara's trembling hand, then took another for himself. "Tell me what to do," he said firmly, looking into her eyes with absolute certainty. "I'm not letting you die. Whatever this bond means, we'll figure it out together." He meant every word. Though part of him recognized the insanity of binding his soul to an alien princess he'd met less than a day ago, Savara's eyes widened with wonder and something deeper, something that looked almost like hope. "Place the crystal against your heart," she instructed, her voice gaining strength from some unknown source. "Think of what you want most, what you need most. The crystal will read your soul and connect it with mine." She pressed her own crystal to her chest, and it began to sink into her skin, not piercing but phasing through as if her body were accepting it home. Dane followed her instructions, pressing the crystal to his chest above his heart. For a moment nothing happened, and then the world exploded into sensation. He felt the crystal merge with his body, settling somewhere deep inside his chest where it began to pulse with warmth that spread through his entire system. But that was nothing compared to what came next. Savara's emotions hit him like a tidal wave. He felt her pain, her fear, her desperate hope all at once. But beneath those surface feelings ran deeper currents. Her loneliness of a life spent as a political tool, her fierce pride in her people and their achievements, and her growing feelings for him, feelings she'd been trying to hide even from herself. The intensity of it drove him to his knees, his mind struggling to process the flood of information. Then his own emotions flowed back to her, and he felt her gasp as she experienced his guilt over the accident, his 8 years of penance disguised as duty, and the way something in his chest had cracked open the moment he'd first seen her dying in that cave. They knelt facing each other, hands clasped between them as the crystals in their chests blazed with light that filled the collapsing chamber. The sensation of their minds touching was more intimate than any physical act could ever be. Dane felt his consciousness brush against hers, and for one eternal moment they weren't two separate beings but something unified, a single awareness experiencing itself from two perspectives. He saw himself through her eyes and was startled by what he found there. She saw him not as crude or primitive, but as someone beautiful in his scarred determination to save lives, to atone for deaths that had never been his fault. The bond snapped into place with a sensation, like coming home after a lifetime away. When their individual awareness returned, both of them were glowing, their bodies wrapped in a cocoon of warm light that held back the deadly cold. Savara's wound was closing before his eyes, the flesh knitting itself together with visible speed. His own bruised ribs stopped aching, and the exhaustion that had been dragging at him burned away in the crystal's fire. "I can feel you," Savara whispered in amazement. Her hand pressed against her chest where the crystal had merged. "Your heartbeat matches mine. Your thoughts are like distant music at the edge of my perception." This is what the ancient text described, but feeling it. She looked at him with eyes that held wonder and joy and terror all at once. Dane pulled her into his arms, needing the physical confirmation of her presence to ground the overwhelming emotional connection between them. "I feel it too. You're there, in the back of my mind, like a warm presence that I know I could reach for if I wanted to." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips in a kiss that was transformed by their new connection. He could feel her response to his touch, her pleasure echoing his own in a feedback loop that left them both breathless. Above them, the temple continued to collapse, but the light surrounding them held firm, creating a sphere of protection against the falling ice. They should have been terrified, trapped in a collapsing building with assassins above and certain death below, but instead Dane felt a strange peace. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The bond assured that much at least. According to the ancient laws, Sivara said softly, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest where his crystal pulsed with light. This bond supersedes all previous contracts and obligations. By merging our life essences, we have created a connection that no political marriage can break. Thorian's claim on me ended the moment we completed the ritual. She smiled, though he felt the worry underlying her happiness. Of course, convincing the Royal Council and the Crimson Dominion of that fact may prove challenging. One problem at a time, Dane replied. Though through their bond he could feel his own concerns mixing with hers. First, we need to survive this mountain coming down on our heads. Then we can worry about interstellar politics and angry would-be husbands. He helped her stand, both of them steadier now than they'd been since entering the temple. The crystals had done more than heal their bodies. They'd restored their strength and vitality. The protective sphere of light moved with them as they ran through the collapsing temple, always maintaining just enough space to keep them safe from falling debris. It was as if the ancient magic recognized their bond and had decided to preserve them. They emerged from a side passage just as the main chamber collapsed entirely. Tons of ice and stone crashing down to fill the space where they'd nearly died. The exit led them to a system of natural ice caves that wound through the glacier's depths. The sphere of light dimmed gradually as they moved further from the heart chamber, eventually fading to a soft glow that emanated from their own bodies. Sivara's luminescent markings were brighter than ever, pulsing in perfect synchronization with patterns that had appeared on Dane's own skin, visible through his torn thermal suit. Your body is changing, Sivara observed, touching the glowing marks on his arm with gentle fingers. The bond is transforming you, making you more like my kind. You will be able to withstand extremes of temperature that would kill any unmodified human. Your lifespan will extend to match mine, several centuries if we are fortunate.